Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Matt Donato. Matt is a partner over at Echelon Risk and Cyber. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate you having me.
Well, thanks for being on as well. Could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career thus far?
Yeah, happy to. So I've been in professional services of some different shape and size for close to 20 years. Started my career on the quantitative risk side of finance for a very brief stint before I realized that I much more enjoy working with people than I do with numbers. Got into the recruiting industry, spent a good amount of time in various different aspects of recruiting, staffing, executive search, worked for a couple of bigger firms, had a chance to go off to business school. And in business school, really had some firsthand exposure to risk management and understanding more on the technology risk side of things, which obviously segued nicely into cybersecurity. On the heels of that, leveraged their entrepreneurial platform at Wake Forest's business school after my first year to launch a startup. And we were a executive search, staffing, and consulting firm that focused in two major areas: cybersecurity and data intelligence. After quickly realizing that if it wasn't paying the bills and starting your own money with starting your own firm with your own money, that business school had to go on hold. I had to go on pause. So I left that, started a former firm that I used to be a co-founder for, called HuntSource. And my former partner and I grew that business over a 3.5-year period. After quickly realizing that COVID was here to stay in 2020 and was hitting people pretty hard, it was a good chance for me to kind of take my chips off the table and move on into a different business, and joined professional services and consulting for cybersecurity, and have been in it ever since, focusing more on providing solutions, holistic solutions for businesses versus just the people side of the equation. Joined Echelon Risk and Cyber, joined forces with Dan Desko, our founder and CEO, at the top of the year in January of 2023, and have been running and gunning ever since. As you mentioned before, Echelon Risk and Cyber is a cybersecurity consulting firm that provides various different types of consulting and advisory solutions across the spectrum of offensive, defensive security, cyber risk and compliance, third-party risk, and virtual CISO services. So here we are.
Very cool. Yeah, I think you might be the only person I know that did some time in recruiting, and maybe I should. Move from recruiting into more of the security consulting space. A lot of my clients over the years have been consulting firms, so I'm interested to hear how that transition has been for you. Did you pick up any best practices from the recruiting side that you're kind of implementing now in a consulting firm?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always viewed myself and was received. My relationships were always well received in terms of a partnership as a trusted advisor. I've always been one to kind of adhere to the trusted advisor principles in business. So I felt like over the years, especially starting and leading my own firm and growing that business, you were really very much involved in C-suite discussions, talking about various different challenges organizations were having, whether they were technology challenges, cybersecurity challenges, risk challenges, people challenges, process challenges. And then it just happened to lead more towards a staffing and talent acquisition discussion. At HuntSource, as we started to grow, we started to look at broader ways to add value and to make impact. And so we started to get more upstream, if you will, into looking at how do we provide a kind of a pod or a team that could support an initiative, whether it's some type of transformation, configuration, some type of project-oriented team that was cyber-focused. We started to swim upstream a bit. So that was my first real kind of place to cut my teeth in security services, and started to do more and more in time. And I felt like it's a very unique perspective because you understand the talent gap. You understand that businesses not only are constrained by various different elements, and sometimes or often it is people. It allows you to have a better baseline in that regard and understand how to operate or come up with a kind of more of an impactful way to add value to a company that's experiencing a variety of problems.
That makes sense. So you mentioned the talent gap there briefly. Would you say that it's a real thing? And if so, what do you think it kind of looks like?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think it's changed form a bit over the last couple of years. Whereas, I'll kind of give you a past, present, future. Maybe that would be a good way to shape it in three different swim lanes. But over the past, I would say 3 to 5 years, even pre-COVID, I mean, the field was growing and growing fast. There was organizations obviously getting compromised with breaches. They're losing assets, losing customer data. You had privacy laws that were changing. You had the infrastructure and environments were obviously moving quickly to the cloud, or still are moving to the cloud. So talent had to be able to quickly train up on those functional areas, and in doing so, the market was just moving incredibly fast. So with the demand growing as fast as it was, people were having to train up and skill up as much as they possibly could. The field in and of itself, broadly speaking, from a macro point of view, was realizing that there was a lot of money being lost. Organizations were realizing that they didn't have the adequate in-house talent, and so they had to leverage third-party resources and firms to be able to provide expertise, and that's very expensive business over a period of time. And so when you want to build a culture, you want to be able to change kind of the landscape of how you're managing your organization and make risk be more of a risk-minded organization. You want to strive to bring people in-house, especially that have niche skills. So companies have just been behind. So on the supply side of the talent, you start to become in high demand for what you do. It drives up the premium significantly. Very, very expensive talent. People have a degree of skill sets, and everybody wants the same skill set. You're looking at a demand supply, imbalance. So as things started to move through COVID, that was very much the same, and then we're pivoting now to a virtual workforce, thus creating much more of a push-pull dynamic. Lots of talent, lots of people in certain functional areas, AppSec, DevSecOps, cloud, just to name three of several, were only wanting and exclusively looking to work remotely. And lots of organizations, during the initial phases of COVID, were forcing their companies to do that for obvious reasons because of the pandemic. However, as we started to climb out of that, organizations wanted to try to bring people back. Talent said, sorry, I've got 5-10 options at once to pick from. I want to be able to work and concentrate in my own home. I have flexibility this way. I'm much more efficient this way, or whatever reason they try to provide justification for. And so, the workforce is still remaining remote or slowly going back, while companies are like, I've got investments in leases and buildings that we own and lots of assets that we own. We want to get people back. We want to create this type of culture. Thus, another push-pull dynamic. I think that's one example of several examples that you could provide around the skills gap. And I think looking at current state of where we are, I still think there's an educational gap, not in terms of colleges and community colleges, secondary education. I think there's a gap there too. Lots of students coming out of school looking for entry-level jobs have struggled. Organizations would love to be able to bring on entry-level people, especially in the small and mid-sized businesses, but they don't have the luxury of that. They need someone that is battle-tested, has experience in one degree or another, understands how to navigate the workforce, or at least the corporate environment. And I think that's been one of several examples in that on the modern front, to where there's a big skills gap. I also see another gap in terms of experienced people wanting to pivot in their career, whether it be midpoint in their career, IT professionals looking to gain more and more security experience, or people in adjacent parts of an organization really enjoying security, really buying into what security is, or maybe they see dollar signs. Whatever their motivation is, there's a want to train up and to make a move into that type of organization. Again, larger enterprises can absorb that. They can plan for it. They can account for it. Small to mid-sized businesses cannot. So I still think the SMB is struggling mightily with that type of scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And in general, from what I see on LinkedIn, from the people I've talked to on this podcast, from all the people I know, there seems to be a willingness or desire to open up more entry-level jobs, to train more junior people, stuff like that. But what ends up happening is everybody says, well, on my specific team, in my specific situation, we can't afford to bring on somebody pretty junior. But if everybody says that, nobody's training. So, do you have any thoughts as far as how we can remedy that from an employer standpoint? Like, could you build a business case for building a training program, basically creating a pipeline of new security hires for, say, it is a large organization and they do have some budget versus an SMB that it may not be practical, or say it's a consulting firm where their people are profit generating, so they know if they train that person, they're going to be up to speed in 6 months or a year, and then they're going to start making their money back. Could you build a
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely, sorry to cut you off. I absolutely think you can and should. I think, especially large organizations, in my opinion, there's really no excuse to not have a talent development or type of career development strategy surrounding more junior talent, or people cross-functionally looking to get more exposure into security and risk. Um, I believe there's ample opportunity there. It doesn't have to be a significant lift. I think there's some underlying assumptions that we have to make. Number one, does the from the top down, does the executive leadership, does the board, does everyone view cybersecurity as one of their primary um, areas of that needs addressing, or areas of concern? Do they buy into that? If so, is it part of their culture? Is it a secure first type culture? Is it the type of social fabric in their environment to where they do want to train up and coming talent, regardless if it's cybersecurity or application development or AI or maybe anything outside of the confines of cyber and technology? If they've created a culture of that, there should be avenues to way to reach down, develop, and train up. Um, so number one, that is definitely a business case. We have found at Echelon a great deal of success, and granted, we are in professional services. In my opinion, that actually creates more of a challenge to put professional service consultants out on an engagement to support a client with a number of different challenges, number of different high stake priorities, and to have some more junior resources who need to be skilled up. However, we have built a good leverage model to where we're bringing in interns who are in college, who are halfway through college, give or take, and we are giving them more and more and more exposure. We're creating kind of a peer-to-peer kind of mentor-mentee program with our existing consultants and senior consultants, to where they're it's kind of a win-win, right? So the consultants get experience with their firsthand at managing or training up somebody, kind of showing them the way. We've created an environment for that where we expect that. And then the other advantage would be, if you're an intern, you're getting some real-time experience. So everybody wins at that point. And we've had a tremendous conversion rate of interns going full-time with us when they graduate and come out of school. Um, I think you can emulate a model like that, and should emulate a model like that in the private sector and other types of businesses, specifically corporate information security. I think if you're not, it's certainly a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the big question that people generally have, especially if they're on a corporate security team, is how long is it going to take to get this person to where we can actually use them for more than just a little bit of grunt work, and what's it going to cost, and what happens basically if somebody leaves after we've trained them up, and say they're a year into their job, especially with Gen Z. I think they're leaving their jobs more often. There's more turnover. I mean, turnover has always been high in security because there's always been a demand for those skills. Once you get that magical year of experience, um, I guess, could you speak to the retention piece and how you might be able to hang on to some of those folks that you've invested in?
Yeah, I certainly can, and it's different for each environment. I think I believe, and through my experience, I believe that companies should have a very clear, North Star. They should have line of sight to where they're going. Should be obviously a call to mission, more or less a value statement, set of value statements and core values in a business of which you have people, regardless of what field they're in and where they are in the organization, supply chain to HR to marketing to cybersecurity teams. They possess the same core values, and their behaviors exude these core values. So you're looking at a cultural, the cultural fabric, if you will, that everyone is marching to the same drum. And in doing so, people have an idea of what's expected of them, and it's a two-way communication. It's a culture of transparency. It's a culture of accountability. Um, it's a culture of mission and purpose. So by doing that, people are joining and being attracted to the organization because they align with the core values of the business, because they align with the mission of the organization. Now, of course, things have to go as planned, or they have to be as real as they say they are. And if you intentionally have set it up that way, and decisions are being made, and teams are being led, opportunities are being given inclusively to the entire organization that aligns with this mission and these core values, things really shouldn't go boom. Now, we live in a world where that obviously is not going to be executed in perfection to that plan. However, knowing what their motivation is and what inspires them, I think transparency and clarity around some of those elements are going to be critical for being able to retain your talent. One thing that looking back to my recruiting days and as an owner of a company and running teams, I always felt like the scapegoat or the shortcut to thinking was the biggest driver was always compensation, always compensation. They're just leaving for more money. They're just leaving for more money. Typically, if you kind of take a step back, zoom out, do a quick analysis on what that is, there's probably some flags that were raised or some markers that you uncovered along the way that didn't just translate to money. It didn't just translate to their primary motivation being compensation. That's not to run interference on. Some people just do want to be motivated by money. They're just chasing the dollar. I believe that eventually will catch up to them and come back to bite them in the butt. However, if you know what inspires them and what they're attracted towards and what they're working towards, as long as you're steadily making traction and moving the needle, if you will, that effectively should create better retention. I do think there's a lot of, I wouldn't say poor leadership, but I see a lot of leaders who've just been kind of thrown into the deep end of leadership and more management, and have been practitioners and kind of hands-on console engineers or administrators who have not really been trained up and exposed to some good leadership. I think that type of gap at the middle ranks of leadership has created lots of challenges. I think eventually people are going to leave inadequate, poor managers, poor leaders, or poor organizations who are run, not run to the way they thought they were going to be run. I think a lot of people are looking to move, and if you add compensation and inability to work remote or do some of the things that you told you're going to be able to do, that's a combination. That's a formula of which creates a negative outcome. So, how do you fix that? Well, everything I mentioned, right? Hard to do, overly simplified, at least as I'm articulating that. I do believe with the right mission, the right vision, the right culture, the right leaders in place, the training and the exposure, I think communication is oftentimes the biggest area of deficiency in teams. I'm just too busy. I can't make time for that. That starts to add up over time where the person's like, I just don't feel like I'm being valued or being heard. And eventually that starts to run amok. That person starts to lose focus, whether they quiet quit or whatever the common phrases are now. They start looking for something else. They start to disengage, and next thing you know, you've lost that person. So retention-wise, there's a lot of different things you could do. We probably could have 4 or 5 fireside chats on different ideas that I have for that we've implemented, but certainly we don't have the time for that. So that's probably the best way that I can summarize it.
That's a great summary. Yeah, there's a few threads we could kind of pull on there. One being, I think that company culture you mentioned kind of needs to come from the top. You need to actually make sure that your organization is living out those core values. I think often what happens is there's core values, they're on the website. Maybe it's in a handbook somewhere, but that's really about it. And it's I would say best practice, make sure those core values are somehow integrated elsewhere in the company. Make it a part of employee reviews and figure out metrics around how somebody aligns to those core values.
Yep.
And if you're screening people in the interview process up front to make sure that they align with those core values, like you said, and you're getting alignment to the mission of the company, then you're more likely to have a longer term match. And setting expectations up front, I'm big on that in the interview process. For recruiters, from the very first conversation, people should know what the company are all about, or is all about. People should know management styles, where the company is headed, stuff like that. You mentioned transparency. That's one of our core values as a company, is transparency. So certainly something I believe in. And I think 360 feedback too, which is another thing you kind of mentioned. People feeling like they have a voice and they're not just a number on a balance sheet somewhere. A lot of folks I'll talk to, especially earlier on in their career, where they don't feel like they have a lot of influence. They may have really good ideas to improve process or technology or save the company some money. But if that stock manager isn't listening to that analyst, they're going to be the first one to raise their hand when the recruiter contacts them.
Yeah.
looking for something else. And so I think sometimes the compensation can be a symptom and not a cause. Cause being other elements that make
Yep.
people unhappy, and
Exactly.
then you get kind of disalignment or disalignment between the employee and then the manager, and then there's some friction that's created there, and then all of a sudden the person isn't trying their hardest, and therefore they're not getting raises, and it just kind of snowballs from there. So
Yep.
yeah, I think you need to catch brewing toxicity or disquiet, lack of comfort and team and culture fit very early. In a lot of cases, those things can be rectified, and sometimes they can't. I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes somebody's not the best fit for a given team at that particular point in that company or that team's growth. Have you ever had that situation where you had to kind of let somebody go, or they weren't working out, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a the natural, unfortunate cost of doing business is not everyone's going to be a fit, and not everyone is what who you thought they were when you hired them. I believe in that what we do professionally requires a great deal of rigor and discipline. A lot is asked of cybersecurity professionals, especially in a changing environment like we're experiencing now. I think if you look at some big triggering events that have taken place, and I certainly won't go into those, but there's a lot of things that are being put out there, from new regulations to new policies to changing of how we protect data, um, and how we protect our network, and we have to look at third-party risks and the various different ways that we need to automate to be more efficient. There's a lot of different moving parts. So I actually do empathize with a lot of leaders who actually do have great leadership qualities that just have been set up to fail in other ways. They're just working so hard to where they're running so hard throughout each and every day, on weekends, at nights, etc., to where it's almost like they just don't have the adequate time set aside to be able to effectively lead a team. Have I been faced with that? Absolutely. There have been some times where you the person's just not willing to go the extra mile when they need to, or what's clearly laid out from an expectations perspective, they're just not living up to those expectations. There's been instances where it's coming down to communication and ability to articulate what's going on. One individual I can recall just painted a rosy picture of what was happening, and then you started to peel back the onion, or inadvertently getting feedback, or seeing some things fall behind on a project basis, and you're just understanding, how did this happen? I was under the impression this is where we were. So there was lessons learned from both ways. We end up moving on from that individual, where we probably need a centralized way to visibly see where we are in various different projects, various different stages of what engagement we're on. Um, some of those engagements were internal, some were external, and not necessarily in this organization, but in my previous one. And within that, people aren't sometimes giving the extra mile. Are given going the extra mile. And I think that's always been a challenge. It's a double-edged sword. You want people who can go the extra mile, but don't want to burn out, or, experience the brain drain to where they're working 60, 70 hours a week consistently, and it's kind of changing their personality. They're starting to become unhappy. And, I couple that with being kind of in the confines of your own home every day, working at home. It's like your surroundings don't change. So yeah, those are tough conversations to have, and I certainly have had them over the years, and it's never fun.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned kind of being stuck at home and how your personality might change with stress and burnout. Unfortunate reality, I think, for a lot of folks in security specifically. What do you do as a business owner now to kind of make sure that folks are not burning out, that they are taking their PTO, and do you set certain organizational standards or rules to get folks to take time for themselves, or how do you manage it?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. Number one, leading by example, setting the stage up front to really communicate that these are dedicated times where we're all going to collectively disconnect or do something outside of what we're delivering from a professional services work, for example. Another way would be to really create kind of a solid one-on-one format each and every week. We have one-on-ones with our teams. We empower our directors, our managers to have one-on-ones. It's expected that they have these one-on-ones, that they follow more or less a framework when they lead these one-on-ones, but they create it to where it's a safe place for that person to show up to the meeting, and it's their time with their manager or their director or their partner, and just really creating the stage to where they get to lead these conversations. They're accountable to show up prepared and drive those discussions and share how are you doing personally. I think a lot of companies, a lot of leaders that I've talked to probably don't really invest enough time in the I wouldn't say the personal relationship, but maybe even the professional relationship. I think that goes a long way. And how are things with family, with your friends, health, wellness. I mean, just checking in on what's happening in their personal life. It doesn't have to be something that's comparable to what's happening in yours. It's just important to pay attention to those and remember certain things, birthdays and significant events and milestones. Secondly, feedback is key. Number one, I think we do a really good job of opening up the door to feedback. We welcome that feedback. There's no other better way to learn as a leader than receiving feedback in real time, in more of a formalized setting. Regardless of the forum, feedback is critical, as are ideas. What do you all think? I never lead a meeting or start a meeting with sharing my opinion or what I believe, unless it's something that we have only 2 minutes to do, and it's like, here's what we have to do because I have more information than you do. I need to make a quick decision. Aside from that, the team typically shows up prepared or provides their input. A lot of folks do a great job of doing their own research, pulling together their own analysis. I think if you're creating an environment like that systemically across the business, it's going to be a very effective and highly thrived organization. So they're just some key things that I think we're doing that's making a huge difference. How do you not oversell work and have the supply to deliver in professional services? It's a very tricky, imperfect process. Unfortunately, it's a good problem to have. Of course, that's the oversimplified way to say it. It's really analyzing where you are as a business, looking at the path forward. We look at our bookings and how people are being utilized, and looking for the longer term engagements versus the shorter term. And then we try to disperse the work accordingly across the teams that we do have, depending on the skill sets that we do have. So we're always trying to round out the teams and navigate the waters as best as we can. But unfortunately, it's not perfect.
Yeah, like I said, I've worked with a ton of consulting firms over the years. Utilization comes into play, looking at booked projects. Then you got, depending on the size of the organization, either the partners selling or you have a sales team selling. You can't always predict, the ebbs and flows of what big project is going to come in when. But I think extremely crucial to have communication between the sales team and, delivery team to make sure that if there is a big project in the pipeline, that everybody is aware of that, and letting HR and recruiting know, hey, this is coming down the pipeline. We may need to get somebody very quickly. Keep that in mind and kind of be putting some feelers out there. I worked for a consulting firm there for a while, and it was basically a mad dash to hire. At every single point that I was there, every single second was, we always got to hire 10 more people. We were hiring very reactively. It was only me doing it. There simply weren't enough resources dedicated to recruiting to balance out all the sales that were happening on the front end. So, do you have any best practices as far as staying ahead of the curve when it comes to the work that you're selling and not hiring purely reactively?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, this is something that I feel like, I personally have spent a lot of time investing in here at Echelon, and I know that Dan and the leadership team has as well. And we're a unified front in this area. It's, you're always recruiting talent. You're always keeping your ear to the market for either up and coming talent or people who are very refined in what they do. They're experts in their own right, in the subject matter that they possess, and always be looking at not only the talent and having proactive conversations, keeping that kind of pipeline rich, but also as you build your brand, do you have you built an evangelized following for people that know who you are, that respect what you do, admire what you do? There'd be social media followers or thought leadership and content that you put out there. You're creating an ecosystem of people who are following the Echelon Risk and Cyber way. And in doing that, people are going to be very interested. So, you couple a variety of different kind of strategies, if you will, together, whether it be proactive recruiting by the leadership team to empowering referrals amongst our consulting teams. We do provide referral bonuses for them. We incentivize them monetarily. We get it. It's the cost of living is only going up across the country, some more than others. So we're trying to incentivize them with little, kind of little carrot and stick ways to get them to try to bring, good people to the table. And look, at the end of the day, good people know good people typically. So by cascading that message to the organization that we are looking for high caliber talent, much like them, and also being very forthcoming by sharing where we're perhaps maybe have gaps amongst these certain practices that we have or areas that we want to opportunistically hire in certain areas, creating that kind of communication throughout the organization is critical. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's not something that you always want to draw to the front end of the spectrum, but we have one-on-ones, we have weekly all hands meetings with our organization. We follow the entrepreneur operating system, the EOS model here. By doing that, we're creating kind of a framework to where people are all kind of working towards the same thing with a very structured type of a format, but it's not structured in the confines or in the terms of being rigid. It's structured in terms of expectations are clearly set, articulated. There's visibility towards what we're working towards together, and and that part of that topic of recruiting and talent acquisition is a living, breathing, proactive process. So when it does come time for us to post a job requirement, which we have a few open for now, and we're going to be putting some more out there here in the upcoming months, people can refer good people, and we typically will have a pipeline of folks that we've been proactively talking to. So I think the passive recruiting, as you clearly know, Pete, is the best way you're going to find talent than it is for the all hands on deck, we're on fire. We need to hire 2 people by tomorrow, otherwise we're going to be in trouble to deliver on this project. That's where you get yourself into trouble. So how do you build a proactive approach and a strategy around that? And I think we've done an excellent job of doing that here.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, I think one thing a lot of smaller companies struggle with is that employer branding piece.
Yep.
They just don't realize that it's a thing. They don't realize that your recruiting team should be communicating constantly with delivery, should be talking to marketing, and the way I see it, basically recruiting is the sales function, and sales should always be working heavily with marketing. So, if you have a good presence on LinkedIn for your company, if you have a good Glassdoor page, which you should, I would say cultivate early and often. That's an important thing because a lot of people go out there and they'll check your Glassdoor page. And the smaller you are, the more it matters too. If Visa has a bad Glassdoor review, somebody can write it off as, oh, well, that person was maybe in a different department. But if you have a 50-person company and there's a few bad Glassdoor reviews, chances are that's somebody that you'd be working with regularly. So,
Sure.
yeah, can't stress that enough. And yeah, on the employer branding piece, if people know who you are, it's much easier to get responses out of them and cold outreach and stuff like that. If, like you said, people know people, that's really the ideal way. If you get referrals, you're getting people that your people already know that are more likely to be a culture fit. And are more likely to work out with you long term, probably less turnover and stuff like that. I think one term that's bandied about quite a bit is culture fit. I think there's some pitfalls there with culture fit, but it's also extremely important. You want people to get along, but you also want diversity of thought. Any thoughts on culture fit and kind of how you would evaluate that without falling into some of the pitfalls?
Yeah, you mentioned diversity in thought is critical. Diversity in other areas is equally as important. Diversity in thought and backgrounds are really important. We have not been a professional services firm who only hires a very prototypical type profile. Meaning we're not just going after the big consulting shops and kind of taking their best talent. We're bringing people in from various different types of backgrounds, whether it be corporate, former military, people transitioning from active duty to the consulting side, or coming from large enterprises. I do believe in large enterprise to a smaller kind of entrepreneurial environment, regardless if it's a professional services firm or a software company, there's always going to be a bit of a learning curve. But when you understand exactly what it is you're getting into and the expectations are clearly set, and you're aligned to the mission and the core values of the business, you're reducing that learning curve as much as possible, especially if you're creating kind of a solid onboarding experience. So I think that type of diverse mindset allows for a richer pipeline of talent. And let's be honest, if you're trying to be a first mover, in certain areas and do things that some other consulting firms are not, of course you're not going to want to go steal from the other kind of consulting models. You want something a little bit different. So defining what different means and still aligning that to the core values of the business. And I feel like I've said core values more times than I can count in this conversation. I do really buy in and believe that is one of the most critical pillars of any organization, that it does lead you to a much higher probability of success when hiring that person.
Yeah, one of the issues I see often in the consulting world is it tends to be a very cannibalistic way of hiring. Everybody else's, every firm basically only wants to hire people from other consulting firms that they would view as their direct competitors. Or, if they're a smaller company, they'd like to hire from the big four. People have that big four pedigree, quote unquote. But I've always found that a very narrow way of hiring, and I don't necessarily think you're always getting the best people that way,
Sure.
and
Right.
you're necessarily limiting your candidate pool. Like, a lot of people don't realize how small the candidate pool is for certain skill sets.
Yeah.
Like, I just talked to a client this week or the past week about they're looking to hire an ISO 27001 lead auditor that had consulting experience, that had done a variety of ISO certifications. There's only a handful of those people in the
Yeah.
U.S. It's
Right.
an international standard, but they want somebody who's a U.S. citizen, has worked in the U.S. at a certification body, which there's only a handful of. uh, you know, that's a very small candidate pool. But if they were able to consider, and I talked to them about this, if they're able to consider somebody who's been through an ISO certification on the client side, that person has been through it. They
Mhm.
just haven't been on the consulting side. And as long as they have good communication skills, there's no reason not to try them out in a consulting role. Unless, of course, your pace, and that's often the pushback I hear is, if they haven't been in consulting before, they can't handle the pace. I would argue if that's the case, then there's more of a problem probably with the pace than there is with the person who
Yeah.
can't handle the pace.
Yeah.
As
It's a tricky balance of on the seesaw. I mean, if the pace is too rigorous and you're moving too fast, and there is a sense that there's a definition of moving too fast for sure. I mean, if you're selling projects and not delivering on projects, or you're just booking out 3-4 months for these projects until you can get started, that's a great place to be in terms of creating scarcity in the market. However, there's a trade-off to that, and you have to be able to adequately staff up by doing it proactively, and having the right types of profiles, diverse profiles, is going to be important. I also firmly believe that kind of elevating from within is critical. I look at the example you just said. I'm like, why is that why are they resorting, or why are they in that situation to where that is the only type of profile they can hire? Is there not a number two who's been longing for that opportunity, has been training for that opportunity? Where's their chance to elevate and expand their range? What has that kind of succession planning been, that talent development plan? Where's that been implemented to where that person can organically come up from within, and then you're building from the bottom up versus the top down? It's always a challenging recruiting strategy, especially for something that very specific, like you just mentioned. I mean, it's only a handful of people that are going to be able to do that. So you're fishing in a very small pond, and chances are you're going to exhaust that pond probably within a few days. So
Hmm.
then what? What's the contingency plan? What's option two? Why can't we run parallel paths here and find different types of profiles that are cross-functionally, can cross-train, or you can elevate from within? Lots of different ways.
Yeah, and part of my advice to that client too was, even if I don't make money off of filling this job for you, I think the best way to do it is take somebody who's done a SOC 2 audit, or a high trust audit or something like that, that has transferable skills that you could teach ISO, send them to get the training and their certification, lead auditor designation, and do that all within 6 months. And then you'll have somebody that you grew internally. That person is super happy to be given the opportunity to learn a new skill set and cross
Sure.
train.
Sure.
Kind of goes back to your point from earlier, where I think a lot of what we're missing as an industry is the appetite to move people from IT into security. And a lot of pushback I'll hear is, all these entry level folks, they just don't have the soft skills and or the technical ability to be able to do security, because they don't understand the basic foundations of technology. But if you hire somebody who's been a technologist their whole life and they've been a sysadmin for 10 years, you don't have that issue. The only
Yep.
challenge you run into there is salary, usually,
Sure.
because you can't pay them an entry level security person salary if they're, senior level career elsewhere. So yeah, just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, soft skills are important. We really harp on that here. I mean, we are at a client-facing capacity, so at the end of the day, we have to be able to communicate our findings, communicate what we're working on, what we're recommending, just among naming three among several different things that require interfacing with a client. And you have to do it in a way that is going to resonate with your audience. Not every audience. Lots of organizations aren't mature and don't know cybersecurity. Maybe the technology leader has enough to be dangerous, but maybe her surrounding team do not. Especially once you start to get into the other areas of the business or even up to the C-suite, that's not really that germane to them. That's not important. You got to be able to in a concise manner articulate things that 3 to 5 sentences that showcases value and shows an impact that's going to have in the business. We spend a lot of time communicating with people that we're talking to in the recruiting process, not just understanding who they are professionally, but who they are personally. Interests, kind of pulling on some of the more personal strings a bit to get them to open up and to feel a little bit safer. I think once people let their guard down a bit, they can start to communicate more. Well, how would you present this? What would you do? Asking some more kind of pointed problem-solving type scenarios, problem-solving type questions, to where you can start to discern pretty quickly how their mind works. How would they explain this? How would they articulate that? How would you work through this scenario? And rather than just showing me in a document, walk me through it. I want to hear their frame of mind. I want to hear their thought process. I think that goes a long way. I think a lot of that stuff can be vetted in the recruiting journey. And at the end of the day, do you like them? Do they align? And does it seem to fit? And by having a diverse culture of thoughts and diverse backgrounds, I think people are going to find that it's a nice, healthy mix, right? That's obviously not a perfect scenario, Pete, but I do believe at the end of the day, you have to like the team that you work with, at least enough to be professional, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And interesting that you brought up kind of in the interview process how you would ask people problem solving questions and get their thought process on things. Uh, One thing I think a lot of companies do poorly is interviews and interview questions specifically. There's a lot of sort of formulaic. I'm going to ask you this technical question to understand your knowledge of this tool. Becomes less about somebody's ability to learn or solve a problem than it is about the nuts and bolts of what specific tool or situation or whatever it may be. But I think if you're able to kind of break through somebody's shell in an interview and get the best out of that person, that's a best case scenario because you've somehow surpassed their rehearsed answers to every standard question out there. If you're able to ask something outside of the box and you spent the time on the front end of the interview developing rapport with that person, like you said, just kind of getting to know that person, you're more likely to get a more genuine, I think, response to some of those questions. And
Exactly.
when that happens, you have, again, a greater chance, I think, of getting somebody on board that's going to be there for the long term. So, yeah, that's a great approach. Are there any specific challenges that you've encountered in hiring, maybe during your recruiting days? Obviously, we kind of speak the same language there. Or now that you run a consulting firm, have those changed at all?
Well, challenges. That's such a It's hard to define what challenges would entail. Yeah, I could chop that up into a number of different kind of categories, Pete, that would probably resonate with your audience. Sometimes the challenges could be alignment internally. This is what we're looking for, the profile, the subjective qualities, the job functionality, the years of experience, the type of experience, environment of which they've gained that experience. I think those things we've ironed out and have ironed out here internally at Echelon really well. I think in other organizations, when you're an extension of a company that you're representing, it takes some time to get to know these businesses, to get to know these organizations. So as an extension and a talent partner like you in your firm, there's a learning curve, quite frankly, right? You hear a lot of the things that you want to hear, the compelling story. Was it about how we run this business, our clients, all the different selling points? And then it's like, tell me the bad and the ugly, right? And then how do you take all that information and take that to market to go recruit a candidate that's going to be a fit for both personally and professionally for their culture. those aren't easy scenarios to do. Is there one particular challenge? You talked. A lot of people don't talk about the onboarding process, but I'm a big. I always focus on the onboarding process. It's one thing to recruit, to attract, to get the talent over the finish line, and then what do you do once you have them? And is the onboarding experience a positive one? Is it one where they gain progress early, they get some easy wins, they get their confidence built up, they get visibility to the team, they start to build relationships, they get exposure to things that they could get exposed to early versus having to wait 6, 9, 12 months without just dumping them in the deep end and wishing them the best of luck. I hope you don't drown. How do you balance that? You want to push, but you also want to provide and provide and provide. And I think there's a balanced way to do that. I've seen lots of organizations fail in the aforementioned. Typically, I ask the question, what does your onboarding process look like? Don't just tell me you're going to cut them loose with one person and they're going to shadow them for a week. How do you do that in a virtual environment? They can't be in every confidential meeting that you're having. And some of that may be completely over their head. So what is germane? What kind of exposure do you have? How are you giving the exposure amongst the team and outside of the team? And what does that format look like? Week 1, week 2, week 5. It's not just the first week either. I believe onboarding is a living, breathing process that should probably take you 60 to 90 days, different for different types of skill sets and different types of levels of experience. And then you have to be able to have quality check-ins literally every single, if not day, in the first couple of weeks, and once a week after the first 3 or 4. And then that formula I just have not seen, practiced effectively in lots of organizations. And even when I joined, we were still trying to figure that out because we were doubling in size, tripling in size. And so we're at that 40 employee mark now where it's like, I think we've done a really good job of refining what that process looks like. Some leaders better than others. Some are still learning how to, embrace the change and still kind of create an experience of onboarding that's going to be a positive one and still gain the type of exposure they need without consuming too much time. Again, the concept of time that we don't have enough of. So I think the onboarding process, circling back to your question, I've just seen big challenges in organizations.
That's a great point, and one that nobody else on the podcast has mentioned thus far. What I kind of take away from that is the importance of having a structured process. I think people get stressed when there's ambiguity and there's no structure, there's no formalization to a process. There's a lot of talk about flexibility and making people comfortable in your organization and developing a good culture and stuff like that. But I also think structure is important. Psychologically, sure, we feel safe as humans when there's structure and we know what's going to happen. That's why I'm such a big proponent of expectation setting as well. So great point. Well, we're coming up on time here, so just one last question for you that I ask everybody. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I've had discussions with folks recently. I think the traditional hiring path of a technical person for each kind of role, each type of functional position in security is not always needed. And I just think there's so much of an emphasis on that in certain areas that just don't believe they need to have that core competency, that inventory of skills. There are adjacent skill sets that you probably don't need to hire a technical person for. I think I still see leadership gaps at the top of organizations, more so now than I've seen in a while. But I'm looking through a different lens and running a consulting firm. I see lots of organizations just doing enough and not doing a great job of running at a leadership level, whether it be the C-suite or the VP level, running kind of an organizational, kind of enablement program versus that of a defensive program. So I just see a lot leadership gaps quite a bit, and I think there's opportunity there. And we don't need to hire the same type of skill set every single time. There's probably comparable adjacent skill sets that we could bring in from a different group and train them up. I just think training and leadership development are two key areas that I think are struggling mightily. Broadly speaking, of course.
Yeah, I mean, one quick question on the leadership piece. You talked about that earlier in the conversation as well. Are there some resources out there that you would say are the best places to go for leadership training?
Yeah, I get asked that question. I don't have a magic blue pill for that, unfortunately. I don't have the easy button. I think there's leadership development there's leadership development groups. There are, you get the IONS exposure at times, kind of a phone a friend, peer-to-peer, CISO to CISO kind of programs that are out there. Gartner has a nice program. There's a few others. I just can't, top of mind, think of it here on a Monday morning. I just think leadership development in its entirety outside of the confines of cybersecurity is really, really important. Situational awareness, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, the kind of key things that we understand, and then the principles of being a trusted advisor. All those elements, I think, combined, people should get exposure to, and they don't necessarily have to pay an arm and a leg to go to a boot camp, to go get an executive coach. I think if it's a constant nurturing and feeding process, variety of your outlet, as long as you're in it and you're doing it and you're nurturing that and it's intentional, I think you'll gain that type of experience. I couldn't give you kind of a one-stop shop that does it all here in this conversation, because it comes down to a variety of different things, and there's lots of different ways to obtain good content and good exposure.
Yeah, makes sense. And I would think you could basically just find a mentor, somebody who's in a leadership role that's done it before, and they may not even necessarily be in your same discipline. They
That's
might
right.
be
That's
in
right.
security. They might be, manager at a manufacturing company. Again, transferable skills. It doesn't need to be specific to your niche.
And I know we're at time. If I may interject, that's actually a great point. Is sometimes if you're talking to a CISO who's led a security organization for 30 years, 20 years, whatever the number of years has been, their lens and their conditioning, there's going to be a degree of bias there that may not transfer over to the program and the business that you're leading, right? The ecosystem, the world it is a lot different. Now, some of the core fundamentals are not terribly different. It's still leading teams and being the C-suite and providing top cover and strategy and protecting the organization. Having said that, the enablement mindset combined with understanding how decisions are made in the business, what's important to the board or what's important to the regulators, what's important to the investors, you do not need someone to help with some of these areas that have been in that seat before, because I think that definition is changing. The access to information is much greater than we've ever seen before. So there's lots of different tools and ways that you can kind of leverage some of these different types of data points to help drive decisions. At the end of the day, they want to instill trust and confidence in you that you can protect the organization, still enable the organization to do what they're doing, and maybe be a differentiation and still be an effective leader where your team can thrive. It doesn't have to be a security leader to do that.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great place to end. Folks want to get a hold of you. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn's always the easiest way. Of course, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to provide my email address. I don't know if this is a forum for that, but LinkedIn's probably the best way to do so.
Awesome. I appreciate your time, Matt. Great talking to you, and thanks, everybody.
Thank you.